What happens when a subtype mindfully, willingly, and without threats or fear chooses to give up their consent? Is this a powerful display of devotion or an act of self-imposed violation? Stay tuned today because I'm breaking down the concepts of micro and macro consent in a way you've never heard before. If you're new to this channel, hello and welcome. I'm Miss LX and I'm so glad you're here because after a Valentine's Day break last week with some soft and sweet scene ideas, we're wrapping up our BDSM key concept series as we dive into the ramifications of micro versus macro consent. Now, consent is paramount in BDSM. In fact, several different acronyms exist within the lifestyle to reinforce the necessity of enthusiastic consent that is freely given without manipulation or coercion. And some of the most common are SSC, RAC, PRIC, and C4, as I call it. And remember, consent is a completely mindful, willing, and uncoerced choice to say yes, and the ability to revoke that yes at any time without fear of repercussions. But as I questioned in the introduction, what happens when someone mindfully, willingly, and without threats or fear chooses to give up their consent? Is this a powerful display of devotion or an act of self-imposed violation? To answer that, we need to jump into the concept of micro versus macro consent. Now, in multiple contexts and industries, micro means small scale and macro means more panned out, large scale. When it comes to consent, micro refers to the individual acts that a submissive experiences within the dynamic, whereas macro refers to the dynamic as a whole. In other words, micro-consent means the submissive can choose to reject or revoke their consent on any individual act or situation they may encounter. Macro-consent means the submissive has chosen to give up their ability to reject or revoke their consent about an individual act or situation they may encounter. And I know this is all still very layered, so I'm going to share an amazing illustration with you that will help simplify and clarify this concept in a way you've never heard before. But before I do, I need to show you the key that unlocks this type of consent: trust. And I'm talking about trust that has been developed through time, trials, and consistency. Trust so deep that you are so fully assured that your partner will honor your well-being, that you are free of analysis, prediction, worry, or control. A trust that is proven that you can be fully safe in your vulnerability and exposure. And in my opinion, that level of trust is not just the key that unlocks this radical display of devotion, but the key that keeps abuse locked away. In other words, macro consent is not something you give to someone you just met on FetLife or a dating app. Macro consent creates dangerous levels of risk in pickup play. Macro consent should be saved for those very rare relationships that grow stronger and deeper with time and trust. With this deep level of trust as the non-negotiable foundation for macro consent, let's take a look at this concept through the lens of what I often refer to as the kinky buffet. If the objective of visiting this kinky buffet is that deep, passionate, erotic, explorative, exciting connection with your partner, in this analogy, that looks like enjoying a meal together at the buffet. But true submission does not happen until there is a disagreement or conflict of wills. So in our story, the conflict, the obstacle, is that the submissive doesn't like broccoli. So that's the context. You and your partner are at the kinky buffet, and the submissive in this dynamic doesn't like broccoli. Now, the submissive is not allergic to broccoli. That would be a hard limit. Hard limits are those things that the submissive can set that say, no, if this line is crossed, I will feel violated. I will feel abused. I will feel neglected. This will be toxic. Demanding that your submissive, in this analogy, eat something they're allergic to is not macro consent. That's abuse. So, micro consent would look like the submissive choosing their own plate and choosing not to put broccoli on their plate. Macro consent would look like the submissive handing their plate over to their dominant, and the dominant adding anything they want on the plate, broccoli included, if they wish. The mentality driving the submissive, however, is even more telling. From the submissive's perspective, they're approaching the buffet with micro consent, thinking, I don't like broccoli, so I'm not going to choose broccoli. Approaching the buffet with macro consent, on the other hand, would be propelled by thoughts like, I trust my dominant's purpose in my plate, even if I don't prefer the food. But as I said a moment ago, authentic consent cannot happen without free choice. And choice always includes the risk of conflict, because you have two autonomous people who are refusing to control one another, and therefore each person has the ability to choose differently than the other. And in this story, the dominant would choose broccoli for the submissive, and the submissive would not. Within the context of micro-consent, the process of conflict resolution might look like this. The dominant puts broccoli on the submissive's plate, and the submissive says, "Ew, no, I don't like broccoli, I don't want it." The dominant goes, "But are you willing to be a good boy or good girl for me and try it?" "No, I would rather take a punishment." "Oh, really now?" "Well, we'll see about that when we get home." The dominant had their will, and the submissive had their own. The dominant allowed the submissive the freedom to revoke their consent and choose the food they prefer. That's micro-consent playing out. Within the context of macro-consent, however, the process of conflict resolution looks entirely different. The dominant puts broccoli on the submissive's plate. The submissive eats the broccoli. Or in the case of some pushback, the submissive might say, "I don't like broccoli, master." And the dominant could reply, "I'm aware of that, but I put it on your plate and I want you to eat it." "Yes, master." Again, the dominant and the submissive each had their own will in this story. But with macro consent, the submissive chose to give up their ability to reject an individual act or situation. They chose not to be able to revoke their consent in that moment. And thus, they submitted to eating broccoli, even if they didn't prefer it. But again, this is a matter of preferences. This is a matter of even soft limits, but not hard limits. We're not talking about going into abusive territory, and that's why trust is the key. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, what about in the case of hard limits? If the submissive can't revoke their micro-consent because they've given their macro-consent, what's to prevent abuse? Well, that's just what I was referring to. Trust. Trust is not only the key that unlocks this type of dynamic, but it prevents abuse. In other words, although there is a risk of violation and abuse when you willingly give up your control and consent to another, trust is the assurance that it won't happen. And that level of trust is what will keep you safe in this type of dynamic. That's why I say don't rush into it. Don't take this lightly. You will be putting yourself at great risk of harm if you are not fully confident in the fact that your partner loves you more than they love their place of power over you. You need to be assured, I'm going to say it again, you need to be assured that your partner loves you more than they love their power over you. So, I hope this simplified and clarified this concept for you, and I would love to hear your thoughts, so comment below and let me know. And be sure you're subscribed and have those notifications turned on, because next week I'm going to share with you how you can approach impact play without the necessity of sadism or punishment.